magic damage, fire damage, bonus versus large, charge bonus, bonus versus infantry, poison, all these different effects on the units of Total War Warhammer 2, but what exactly do they do and how are we supposed to use them? As the game only offers a vague tooltip of what these effects do, allow me to elaborate. Now, before we delve into all of that, let's make sure we understand how weapon strength works first of all, because that's important to know. Your weapon strength, as you can see, is a number on a bar. In this case it's 50 for the Black Orcs, which is the combined number of two separate types of damage, base damage and armor piercing damage. In this case you can see that base damage is 14 and armor piercing is 36, adding up to that 50. And the little armor piercing symbol next to the bar signifies that this is a unit that has predominantly armor piercing damage more than base damage. The difference between the two damage types is that armor piercing damage is always applied no matter how much armor a unit has, so for every swing of a Black Orc's axe they're guaranteed to do 36 damage, provided that their attack lands of course. And then they have a chance, an RNG roll on their base damage to potentially do up to 14 extra damage as well. It could do 14, it could do 9, it could do 4, could do 0. And that's all on a dice roll, which is affected by the opponent that they're striking's armor. The more armor a unit has, the more chance it has to avoid base damage. So armor piercing damage is always applied and base damage has a chance to be applied, but the enemy's armor might protect it from base damage. This is why picking your targets with your units in terms of damage type is very important. If you have a unit that has lots of base damage and very little armor piercing damage, they're not going to do so well fighting heavily armored units. They need to fight lower armored units so that they have a good chance that their base damage will hit. If a unit has high armor piercing damage, however, they can still take on lower armored troops just fine, although it might be a bit of a waste of their talents of armor piercing, so they may be best off looking for those heavily armored enemies to make the best use of their high armor piercing damage type. Okay, so we understand base and armor piercing damage. Now let's talk magical attacks. Demonstrated by our lovely aspiring champions here. They have magical attacks indicated by the icon next to their melee attack, which is also really applied to their weapon strength. So what exactly do magical attacks do? Well, they remove the advantage of having a physical resistance from those units that have one. For example, the War Dancers for the Wood Elves. They have this little white shield icon at the bottom of their unit card, physical resistance 20%. This means that physical melee attacks will be reduced by 20% of anyone who hits them. What magical attacks do is simply ignore that, because while units with magical attacks still are technically physically attacking, their weapons are imbued with magic, and the magic is doing damage that physical resistance can't stop magical damage, so it takes away the advantage of having a physical resistance. This means if you have a unit that has magical attacks, their best target to go for is going to be somebody with a physical resistance, potentially. Depends on the unit types, of course. But that's the idea. If a unit has magical attacks, it probably wants to go after something with a physical resistance to take that physical resistance advantage away from it. And that brings us to ghosts, spooky ethereal units, mostly for undead factions. As the ethereal trait says, they ignore most damage done by non-magical attacks. This is represented again by a physical resistance of a whopping 75%. So all non-magical attacks will only do 25% of their weapon strength. And as ethereal units are typically ghosty magic-y types, they also have magical attacks themselves. But one of the downsides of being ethereal is that you'll have a much smaller health pool than other units of your type. So the Banshee is a hero. If you look at other heroes in comparison to her, you'll notice they have a fair bit more health than she does. And also ethereal units have no armor, but they are of course saved by their physical resistance. So relying on that 75% physical resistance, you can imagine what happens to these units when their physical resistance advantage is taken away by units with magical attacks. The combination of low health and no armor means these units get royally annihilated when their physical resistance is taken away. So if you face ethereal units, you'll want to bring units with magical attacks to take care of them with absolute ease. Although if you're the one with the ethereal units, you'll want to be careful to keep them away from units with magical attacks. So magical attacks are all about nullifying physical resistances. Simple as that. I probably could have just said that sentence and that would have been enough. Whatever. But wait, there can be a downside to having magical attacks because some units have magical resistance. In this case, dwarfs, they all have 25% magical resistance. So if a unit with magical attacks fights any kind of dwarf, they're going to have their weapon strength reduced by 25%. So do be wary when picking targets for your magical attack units, because if they fight a unit that has magical resistance, then they're going to be much less effective. Fire damage then. Another thing that is applied on the melee attack by the fiery symbol next to it, but also again is applied to the weapon strength really. Most of the time this will be useless against most units, but there are certain... Whoa, I think my balls just dropped. Most of the time this will be useless against most units, but there are certain units that are weak to fire, mostly regenerating units and wooden units. Wooden units, being things like Dryads, Treekin and Treemen, have a 25% weakness to flaming attack units, like the Knights of the Blazing Sun here, so they're taking an extra 25% damage of what other non-weak to fire units would. And the same for regenerating units. You can see here 25% weakness to fire damage, which is just one of the downsides to having regeneration. So if you expect a lot of regenerating units or wooden units, bringing units with flaming attacks can have its advantages because they can do extra damage to them. It's a good matchup for the unit with flaming attacks. But again, there is a potential downside. Take these peasant bowmen with fire arrows. They'll do great against units with a weakness to fire, regenerating units, wood units, but some units have a resistance to fire, like the Arcane Phoenix, a whopping 70% resistance to fire. This means when the Bretonnians fire their toasty arrows at the fire-resistant target, their damage will be reduced by 70% of whatever their weapon strength is on that missile attack, which as you can see means they're doing very little, if anything, to this Arcane Phoenix. Even with all these volleys, it's barely done any damage at all, because it's been reduced by 70%. So if you have a unit with fire attacks, make sure they don't go after a unit with fire resistance, because they will do sweet FA. So that's magical attacks and fire attacks. Some units will have both, like the Holy Wardens here, which can make them pretty versatile in their targeting, but also means they do have to be careful of those with resistances to fire and magic, because that may be a bad target for them too. And all of this with magical and fire attacks also applies to spells. If you use a spell on an ethereal unit, it'll do a hell of a lot because it's magical damage and they don't have a lot of health. If you use a fireball spell on a lord, it would do extra damage to Durthu, let's say, because he's a wooden unit with a weakness to fire, and it would do a lot less damage to Imric, who has a resistance to fire. But if you hit Karl Franz with a fireball, it'll just do the normal damage with no plus or minus from having flaming attacks. So it all works the same when casting spells as well. And just for a quick word on poison attacks as well, although it's fairly well explained by the tooltip, it shows you exactly what it does. Mostly it reduces damage output of the enemy and reduces their speed. These kind of units can be useful to mix in with non-poisonous units to help them out. Take these 2 units of Orc Boys charging into High Elf Spearmen. I'm going to send some Goblins in with them, spread them nice and wide so that they touch both of these enemy High Elf units and reduce both of their stats. Which, like I say, will reduce the damage output of these High Elf Spearmen, not that it's dangerous anyway, but still it's going to help out this little front line I've got going. So poison is really there to help the survivability of units, and also it's really good for catching units as well. If a unit is fast and you poison it, it'll reduce their speed, making them easier to catch, or to stop them from catching you. Okay, now to some of the big bonuses. Charge bonus, bonus versus large, and bonus versus infantry. To understand those latter two, we first need to understand charge bonus, which works like this. When a unit charges into another, it gains its charge bonus, which increases its melee attack and weapon strength for 13 seconds, degrading the bonus by about 7% every second until it runs out. So basically, it just makes a unit do more damage for a short amount of time once it's charged in. To give an example, let's say we've got a unit with a 40 charge bonus and 100 weapon strength. When they charge into another unit, they'll get that 40 added onto their melee attack, and they'll also have 40 damage added onto their weapon strength. But is it base damage or armor piercing damage? Well, it's both. Whatever the ratio is of their weapon strength, if it's 60% armor piercing and 40% base damage, that's what will be applied to the charge bonus. That 40 will be split 60% armor piercing, 40% base damage. So that's the details of it, but that's not essential to know. All you really need to know is that when you hit things with a charge bonus, they do more damage, and it's good to get charge bonuses as often as possible. It's also important to know that you have to click attack orders on enemy units to get them to charge. They'll enter an attack animation, and on contact will receive their charge bonus. A unit also gains 15 leadership when charging as well. So you have to make sure you're clicking your attack orders on enemy units. The unit will then run towards the enemy, and when they get close, they'll enter their charge animation and hit them with the charge bonus. If you simply let them walk into each other, it doesn't do anything. If you click a move order behind the enemy unit and they just happen to bump into them on the way, they won't get their charge bonus and you won't do that extra damage. Another factor that goes into charge bonus is charge impacts. On impact, units will do more damage depending on how fast and how heavy they are. And while we can't affect the mass and weight of a unit, we can affect the speed. We can make them run faster in certain ways. Running down hills, using abilities or spells, some of these can increase speed, making units hit a little bit harder on their charge because of that extra speed. There's a slight damage multiplier that can make collisions slightly more powerful. But we can also do the opposite. We can slow things down, which will take away some of their charge impact damage. Spells or making things run uphill or poison, these all slow things down, making their collision damage a little bit less, thus saving you some pain. So that's charge bonuses. Makes you do extra damage by adding onto your weapon strength and melee attack. Hopefully you understand that point as we roll into bonus versus infantry and bonus versus large, which work kinda the same. Units with a bonus versus infantry, like the death runners here indicated by the bonus versus infantry symbol, will get an increase to their melee attack and weapon strength when fighting small entities, which is pretty much all infantry. You can tell what size a unit is by the little icon on the unit card here. So it's basically like a constant charge bonus that is applied when you're fighting the right kind of unit, in this case infantry, small entity infantry. So you can see the death runners have a 10 bonus versus infantry, so when they fight infantry they get an extra 10 melee attack and an extra 10 damage on their weapon strength, again spread between the armor piercing and base damage ratio. If they fight any other kind of unit, if they try to take out cavalry, if they try to take out monsters or large lords, they won't get these bonuses and they won't be quite as effective because obviously you're paying for that bonus versus infantry a little bit. That is really where they shine. And as for bonus versus large, you guessed it. It works exactly the same as bonus versus infantry, applies the melee attack and weapon strength of whatever the bonus is, only against large targets though. Again, you have to check the entity size, but it's fairly obvious for the most part. Cavalry, monsters, single large monsters, large lords, chariots. These things are large targets that will activate, shall we say, this bonus versus large and give the extra 15 melee attack and weapon strength to these Eshin triads when they fight those large targets. If they fight infantry, they won't get those bonuses, so they're not as effective there. They need to really be fighting large things to make the best use of themselves. So quite simply and quite obviously, if a unit has a bonus versus infantry, try to send it mostly after infantry. If it has a bonus versus large, it mostly wants to try and fight large things. However, it's not necessarily completely wrong to use units against the wrong kind of target because the units have to be adaptable. For example, with the High Elves, you'll often see High Elf Spearmen used as a front line against infantry when they have a bonus versus large. This is fine though because they just happen to be a more cost effective and sturdy option than any other High Elf cheap options like the Rangers, so it's fine to use High Elf Spearmen against the wrong target. So that is bonus versus infantry and bonus versus large. So that covers the main bonuses and effects that you get on weapon strength and melee attack. You may see some other effects out there like armor sundering or frostbite or leadership debuffs, but those are all fairly self-explanatory on what their job is for the unit. One last thing I think it's important to mention is about modifiers. Let's say in terms of buffs, if you buff your unit's weapon strength or their melee attack or their melee defense, it's good to know that you're always buffing their base statistic, even if they're already buffed. For example, if you had a lord with 400 weapon strength and you gave him a buff that gave him an extra 100% weapon strength, that'll give him another 400 weapon strength, so he'll have 800. If you then gave him another 100% weapon strength buff on top of the one already going, it won't add 100% of 800, so that would be 1600 weapon strength, right? That would be ridiculous. It always adds on to the base statistic, so again 400, add on another 100%, so that's an extra 400 added on to the 800, so you'd have 1200 weapon strength. I'm not sure you can actually do that, by the way. I don't think there's two buffs like that you could use, but you get the idea, you get the maths of it. You don't get to multiply already multiplied numbers. You always multiply the base statistic. Hopefully that made some sense. So there we go. A whole bunch of bonuses and status effects, what they're supposed to do and where you are supposed to use them. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the future.